All right, hello. Welcome to Deeper Than Dogma. Tonight we will be talking with Dave S. about his field of study, the psychology of beliefs. Now, I know that this is a very broad topic, and we were kind of discussing this before we went on air here a little bit, but could you maybe just elaborate a little bit on what specifically it is that you are researching right now?
Right now, cutting edge stuff. I'm studying the role of personal values on the acceptance of scientific evidence in relation to socio-scientific issues, which gets easier to say the more you say it. So basically, what that means is it's what I thought was, but I'm not sure anymore, the first step when it comes to accepting science. So basically, we all have values. We all have sort of, it's kind of like a personality trait in that we have things that we value. We can't think of a better word than that. And basically, what impact do these values that we all have on sort of the further acceptance of science? So is that the first obstacle you've got to overcome, that you've got to have a certain value set in order to actually accept science? So that's kind of the question I'm trying to answer.
So you start off by saying the social scientific issues. Could you elaborate a little bit more on what is a social scientific issue compared to any other any scientific issue?
I guess it's where society and science collide. So, for example, the four topics I picked was evolution, which in Britain it's less of a socio-scientific issue, but something I'm still interested in. Vaccines, GMOs, which is genetically modified organisms, which includes like crops and animals, and to a lesser extent like genetic modifications of genetic engineering and so on. And finally, did I say vaccines?
I think
If
you
not,
did.
so vaccines, GMOs. Oh, climate change. That was the other one. So basically, it's issues that social policy as well as scientific evidence sort of collide. So, for example, with climate change, if politicians don't do something about climate change, we are going to destroy the world. This is the sort of impact of where science and sort of social policy meet head on. I think, like I say, it's more. I'd probably be suited in like Bible Belt in America rather than Northwest England because not many people here are as sort of staunch when it comes to these issues.
Right.
But still an interesting topic, and obviously when I did it online, I got people from all around the world. So it's where, like I say, it's
Yeah,
sort of
yeah.
fun to.
Ever need anything? I'm in the Bible Belt as well. I don't get around as much, but ever need any info from here? And you're saying it's how why we should value certain things in science, or why we do. I mean, why certain people do value certain things in science, and
Yeah, it's more the latter. It's what values we have and this impact that it has on science. For example, as I've done the data collection now, so people can still do the questionnaire if they still want to, but I've officially sort of stopped collecting things for analysis, so I can actually say what I'm actually studying. So the four values I'm interested in are openness to change versus conservation. So as the name suggests, openness to change is someone who's sort of flexible and wants to keep it basically doesn't want to maintain the status quo, whereas conservation is a value of tradition and so on. Because of the nature of science, and we probably all are far too aware of this, it is always changing. For example, I remember watching 100 Reasons Why Evolution is so Stupid by Kent Hovind, and him saying, well, in 1970, whatever it was, they thought the Big Bang, they thought the singularity was 10 million kilometers wide. Then they thought it was like 4 million. Then they thought it was like the width of a proton. Oh, look, isn't science so crazy for going all these wild fluctuations?
right.
But that is the nature of science. The more we know about this. So, for example, my grandma is a perfect example of someone who values conservation. In
Right.
that she says, "Oh, every time I go see her, it's like, oh, Dave, you'll never guess what they're saying this week. They're saying margarine's bad for you. We're getting too much of it. It's
Yeah.
causing heart disease. Last week they're saying we're not getting enough of it. This week they're saying, we're getting too much. When will it end?" Whereas someone like me would say, well, now we know more about, for example, how the fats are stored in the body and what the impact is on health. Whereas she likes to maintain this sort of status quo and doesn't like rocking the boat and so on. So
So
when science as an
yeah,
enterprise is based
right.
on change, that's one of the values that seems to be
Good.
associated with the.
Can I
Value.
jump in there?
Well, value.
One of the things with
Good.
your grandmother's thing, I think that's more to do not with science, but the way science is reported in the press, and generally it's either done for political reasons. I agree with the results of this study, and a lot of the time studies aren't that great a study, small sample sizes, and there are some people in the science fields who are just trying to grind their own axe, trying to find you know, the evidence that supports their narrative.
Well, it's contingent upon the knowledge that we have, and me looking at it, even like you say, through the press. My decision on it's still contingent upon the knowledge that I have. Whatever I'm getting, if that's my only source of info, that's the only
Plus, we
knowledge I
live
have.
in a world where things aren't always inherently good or bad.
Right.
There are trade-offs. Like, for instance, something could increase our risk of cancer, but massively decrease our risks of death due to starvation.
Actually, one of the things that you brought up, actually, with that trade-off as well, and this is one of the questions that I have when you talk about kind of like values and science kind of clashing here, is that one of the social scientific issues that I know has been around for a while is things like animal testing, where this is something that, for example, it is a completely polarized issue because there are some benefits to it, but I mean the amount of value that we place on the well-being and stuff of the animals, it gets into a clash here between essentially science and those values. I had a point to this, the one along which has this question, but um, is science and the values that some people hold, are they when they clash like this, would science sometimes is science in the wrong? I guess maybe you could say.
Is you sort of bringing up the point, if I can try and sort of like put in another thing, like a lot of the work and understanding we know about genetics comes from the experiments done on the Jews during the Second World War by Mendele. So extremely horrible thing that happened, but yielded a lot of really important knowledge.
A lot of medical stuff has come from it.
Yeah, I guess actually, you know what, Benny put it right, actually, in the side chat here, is that values sometimes collide with each other. How do we come to terms with what takes priority over another?
That is pretty much the million-dollar question, I guess. And like you say, with things like animal testing, it's sort of when you get to the extremes like the PETA, they value animal life above. I keep saying animal, above humans almost. That animals take priority, which to me seems very bizarre and counterintuitive. But you get that sort of extreme, and but when push comes to shove, will they also accept treatments? For example, I can't remember which one it was, but it might have been smallpox. But one of the giant of drugs, I think there's a list of like at least 20 or 30 treatments and things that are widely available that came from animal testing, like almost exclusively.
Right.
And so if push comes to shove, will they, accept this treatment? And the answer is it depends on them. And this is where, for example, it's so easy for us to almost scoff at these sort of complaints. In the same way we look at like these YouTube and Tumblr feminists who are sort of like, oh well, all these things that men are doing, manspreading. I remember watching that video; it was hilarious. And,
God!
And it was sort of like, because they can, they do. Because they can complain, they do. But when it comes to like feminists and animal testing and so on, because we have the benefits of it, we can refuse it. Whereas some people, it is their only option. For example, like you're saying with the Holocaust, it brought out or mass-produced like ammonia. And I remember Thunderfoot talking about this with very comfort, saying, it saved or is helped billions of lives because of the mass production of food. And it's that toss-up between is the however many million deaths from not only the Holocaust but the Second World War as a whole, is that comparable to saving or helping billions of people live for food? And these values do collide, and it's very interesting to see what takes precedent at what times. But because we live in this in the Western world, we do live, for example, we have plenty of food, we have a lot of rights that a lot of people don't, so we can afford to campaign against animal testing and so on. But when push comes to shove, if that ever went, for example, if the population goes too high, or for whatever reason we lose a lot of either medicinal or food production, I can't imagine those rights or those campaigns would last very long, and people would turn into savages very quickly.
Right.
So I think what we're basically saying is it's okay to put a load of cats into a camp and then experiment them on them for medical research and call it Meowschwitz.
Only if you know that it's going to cause a great benefit.
Well, here's a funny thing as well. I do remember hearing something about how they were working on giving testosterone to pregnant women to try and create, you know, the ultra manly man, sort of like perfect soldiers. And obviously, what they ended up with was a lot of Asperger's sufferers because high doses of testosterone during fetal development is what creates Asperger's. Um, so I thought that was a very interesting thing.
I still see it as, like you're saying, still contingent. It's not from, but it's contingent on what we know at the time. If you knew it was going to cause this great benefit and that it was going to be all this, that would have to be on your knowledge that you would know it do this. And why should I? Why should I value that it's going to do that?
Mm.
It's kind of like, sorry, I don't know.
No, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, if anyone actually studied the history of psychology, it is littered with the most barbaric, medicine's had a pretty patchy history, but
Trepanning, I think, is one of the worst one. I think for mental health, where they used to put screws into people's heads and stuff like that, lobotomies, electroshock, and all of yeah, psychology has some barbaric stuff, and even the stuff around psychological health as well. But I did remember one thing: weren't dildos invented to cure hysteria in women? I believe.
Yeah.
I have heard that, but I guess to stand up for psychology a little bit, particularly ECT, which is electroconvulsive therapy, which was passed around, that wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Okay, I'm not saying it's a good thing, but basically the thought process is it's not just let's electrocute people. It's basically after seizures, people who have seizures, they have, obviously, if you don't know what seizure is, it's basically rapid firing between the two hemispheres. So basically between, if you put your hand down the top of your head there, that's where the corpus callosum is, which basically connects the two hemispheres of your brain. And basically what happens is there's rapid firing between the hemispheres there. So one way of curing that, quote unquote, was to cut the corpus callosum, which meant basically you had two brains, which basically meant half of your body did one thing and half your body did the other. So that wasn't a great thing.
A bunch of crazy stuff.
Yeah, and alien hand syndrome and so on.
Yeah.
But ECT was basically after they had a seizure because of this sort of extended electric surge almost. They felt euphoric. So basically the thought process was, hang on a minute, if a surge of electricity essentially causes this euphoria in patients with seizure, patients who've just had a seizure, why don't we just electrocute people who have, I don't know what was used to treat, but I think it was depression. Why don't we just cut out the middleman and just electrocute them? So it wasn't this barbaric, let's just electrocute people. There was method in their madness.
But they did, there was a lot of things that it wasn't actually useful for where it was getting used for as well. There are a lot of a lot of ailments, mental ailments that it wouldn't have an effect on, and it was being used on these people as well.
Oh yeah, of course. As with everything, I just don't want people thinking it's just psychologists electrocuting people in the head.
Right.
In the same way, lobotomies, there is again method in the madness of, but the original ones were barbaric. They basically just pulled up your eyelid. Sorry if anyone's squeamish, duck away now. I'm not doing it, but basically they pulled up your eyelid and got like an ice pick and started hammering.
Yeah.
Lobe.
I've seen that done. It's nuts.
Yeah, there's a
They had
documentary.
that in an episode of House, actually.
Could be. It's crazy though.
They talked about it. It was the one where the black guy gets sick. There's like this cop who's growing weed, and he's like ill, and he gives the guy an ice pick. He gives Foreman an ice pick because they're in quarantine to try and biopsy part of the guy's brain.
Yeah.
So back to the topic of the values there. The values that we hold, do you think that do we hold our values based on emotions, or do you think you can rationally come to decisions about the values that we hold?
I think there's a certain tendency towards for some people to hold, I guess, emotional values. So, for example, whenever I hear people arguing against, for example, like gay adoption and gay marriage, you can clearly tell it's sort of this post hoc rationalization of, okay, I'm repulsed by homosexuality. What can I use to justify that? For example, in my very early days, I did a video about I think gay adoption, and it was sort of like because gay people are more likely to get ill, they shouldn't be able to adopt.
Yeah.
And then you think, well, if they took that to the logical conclusion, then they should say that any ill person shouldn't be able to adopt. But they're not advocating that. They're saying because this group is specifically more prone to getting ill. Whether that's true or not is a different issue. But when you think about when they're actually arguing is saying that promiscuous, gay people tend to be more promiscuous, therefore they shouldn't be able to adopt. And you just think that's very obviously this post hoc rationalization of, I don't like the sound of this, what can I use to justify it, rather than let's follow the evidence where it leads, it's sort of top down versus bottom up. So I think some reasoning is certainly emotional, and
we've been arguing that all day with another guy. We've been arguing exactly what you're saying.
Yeah, and I think it's one of these issues that you can't like when I did my video on, it might have been the dinosaur one actually, it was the moral dumbfounding effect, which we briefly mentioned before we went on air. It's things like, when we talk about the particular scenario that I mentioned in my video was a very, I think it's a fictitious one. You can come up with a situation in which, for example, incest, it's like, if they use protection and they both enjoy it, but they decide never to do it again, is that morally wrong? We have this moral repulsion to, rightly or wrongly, we have a repulsion to certain things, and then we try and rationalize why we have that repulsion. Even when our last argument's been shot down, we still have this sort of, I still think it's wrong, but I can't quite articulate why. So we do have this sort of
we got taken to pedophiles and the same things today, and the same thing you just said, and it was, I was trying to ask why, if you remove the social stigmas from things and look at them objectively, and there's no harm being done, and in some instances promoting well-being, but a lot of times without the harm, where is the moral wrongness of it?
Exactly, and I think was it Benny who just put it in the comments that we become, Michael Shermer's analogy is we become lawyers trying to build a case rather than a judge in the search of truth, and I think that's a wonderful, analogy, I guess, of we don't try and come to this truth. We try and rationalize a position. I think, rightly or wrongly, we all kind of do this at time to time. In the same way, I think we're all kind of motivated skeptics at the time. We all engage in sort of disconfirmation bias of, if I said something that no one agreed with, for example, the dinosaur video. If it was a video of an ostrich, I wouldn't have spent so much time trying to hunt down the video from Jurassic Park and then try and line up the video so it looked like that and so on and so on, because the claim of an ostrich existing isn't really something that challenges me, whereas it doesn't really challenge me if dinosaurs still exist. It'd be cool if they did, but because that violates everything I know about the universe, we engage in disconfirmation bias, which is kind of like the antagonist of confirmation bias, in that we are more skeptical of claims that we disagree with, and we sort of take on the claims that we already agree with on face value. So I think, sorry, I've just completely gone on a tangent there. I'm sure there's a question. It was about emotional reasoning and so on. So I'm trying to bring it back now.
Value. How does emotional value play into? Does it have to, and how does it play into it?
I think, like I say, with in the same way with analytic thinking, which if anyone did the OSI, which was the sort of the ordinary science intelligence, which was the first sort of scientific questions, the last three questions were sort of analytic reasoning. So, how much do you value intuition, essentially? And what I found very, very interesting is not many people got one or two questions right. Most people either got them all right or got them all wrong. So what that suggests is that people have this sort of intuitive thinking. So the OSI was, the three questions had intuitive but wrong answers. So if anyone got the obvious answer, then you probably got it wrong.
Does right and wrong actually play into it? Does whenever you're talking of emotions and feelings, or?
Well, what I mean in that case is, for example, there was the specific question was like, a bat and a ball costs £1.10. The bat costs £1 more than the ball. How much does the ball cost? The obvious answer is £1.10p, but obviously that's not £1 more. That's 90 pence more. So the actual answer is £1.05 and 5 pence. So the obvious answer is the actual wrong answer. So there is a certain tendency. I've not actually done the analysis yet, but I will do, where there's a link between theism and intuitive or getting intuitive answers wrong. I know there is a paper out there that does actually do the same thing by, I think it's Will Gervais, I think, and some guy, Norizorion, can't pronounce his name. But basically, they found that theists value intuition. So this sort of, and I don't think it's a coincidence that also theists, going back to the whole emotion thing, also are kind of repulsed by things like homosexuality, and I think they use their religion as a shield of, well, it's not me that's against homosexuality, it's God, and I'm just doing what God says. If it was up to me, I'd be all for their rights, but it's this God thing that's getting like, oh, don't jam God. So I think this sort of
No, this is the conversation we just had was, and the guy would go to, or anybody in the room that was a Christian was going to that. It's based on that. I go with God, kind of thing.
And I think, like I said, I think I'd love to do an experiment, something like present like fundamentalist Christians with like a fake news report of we've just found a new manuscript which Jesus says, you know, homosexuality, there's nothing wrong with homosexuality. Would they still value the Bible over, you know, or their interpretation of their Bible over
Right.
this new fictitious finding? It'd be very interesting to find out, because I don't think they would change. I think they would say, well, no, it's a forged document, or
Oh yeah, that's a crazy coincidence. I was just leaving the room. A guy had brought exactly what you're saying up. That he actually had some verses that would go along with it, and the guy
Do you
would
know
not
what I
accept.
find funny? If you use their arguments against them, yeah, just watch how their brain explodes. Like the one where the "I'm God, why do you believe the lies of the deceiver?" They'll start trying to use the Bible, and then they'll just start getting very angry because there's this sort of weird thing where the brain just goes cannot compute, and just it seems to shut down, and then they just seem to get more and more emotionally driven to and more and more angry.
I think, and also what I don't, you probably don't need to hear it, you know, me telling this, but it's been demonstrated that emotional beliefs that have an emotional core are much more resistant to change, or much
Right.
less resistant to change, I say, than rational ones. For example, if the evidence, you know, sways your opinion, you don't really care. For example, Nephilim Free is never going to accept evolution as long as he has this emotional tie to creationism and against evolution, in that because it's an emotional core. And like I did just post a video about 10 minutes before we went online about cognitive dissonance, so people probably haven't seen it yet. But what it goes into is State of Daniel, who I actually quite like, but he relayed the news report of an atheist who died twice and came back to life both times, weirdly, but found didn't see anything. Just it was like being passed out or being asleep. Didn't see heaven, didn't see hell, didn't have a flash of light, didn't have all his friends and relatives waving at him. Didn't have the last scene in Titanic where everything was literally nothing. And he said for about 20 minutes his heart was racing, and that he couldn't, he was amazed that he was sort of challenging, or maybe not challenging his belief, or questioning his belief. And then he sort of got over it and thought, well, he's an atheist, so he probably didn't see God because he's an atheist, and he was just being annihilated, or coming up with these rationalizations. And like I say, it's an emotional core, and what I find interesting is, he was almost disappointed that there was nothing after death, and it's like, well, it's like, you see these like Nigerian scams. It's like, get an email saying a Nigerian prince wants to give you $10 million. And it's like, you start thinking about how you'd spend the money, and then you find out it's a scam. You haven't lost anything, you haven't gained anything, you haven't lost anything, but you can't help but think of, oh, what would I have done with the money? And you think, it never existed. There was no money there to, there was no tangible money there. But you can't help, certain, or at least certain people can't help to think, well, what if, what would I have done with the 10 million? And start ruminating about this money that never existed. In the same way, as far as I can tell, an afterlife doesn't exist, but people think, because it's been toyed with me of this idea, well, there might be an afterlife, then I've still got something to hold on to. It's like, if it's not there, then it was never there, and if it was never there, then we shouldn't really lust after something that doesn't exist. In the same way, you can't lust after this $10 million that never existed. And I find that very interesting, that people, for me, it was a non-story, because someone, I don't like the word died, but someone went close to death essentially, and nothing happened. In the same way, when we, it's like trust takes, it takes years to build up trust, and it takes a second to take it away. It's kind of like that, in that, rightly or wrongly, if you do something, that violates someone's trust, things just don't go back to normal if you say you're sorry, or if you make amends for it in whatever way. So we have this brain in which we don't just sort of forget about things in an instant. It's a case of, in a way, what has been done cannot be undone.
Right. No, I'm following exactly.
In the same way, a lot of... Sorry.
Good.
I was going to say, in the same way, a lot of... if you, for example, the start of spiritualism, if I don't know if people are aware of this, was actually a fraud. Well, I say fraud. It was three sisters. I don't know if you know the Fox sisters, but I think they were from New York. And basically, what they were doing was, sorry, this is a massive tangent here, but basically,
No, you're good.
It's they were like dislodging their joints, so it made like a clicking sound, and their parents didn't know they were doing. So the children, I think they were children at the time, said, "Oh, it's this ghost of someone," and that's how spiritualism started, from these little girls dislodging their joints, making weird noises, and parents thinking, "What the hell's going on?" and them claiming it's a ghost. And then only, I think, a few decades later, I think the last one confessed, "Yeah, we made it all up." By that time, what had been done cannot be undone. So it's not as if people go, "Oh, it was all a hoax. Oh, it was all wrong then." In the same way, the Loch Ness monster, that first picture was a hoax. Bigfoot, I think, was a hoax when it first started. But just
Crop
because the first one was a hoax,
circles.
So I'm sorry. So Chaz, you wanted to add something here, but I got a question actually after that as well. I'd like to throw in.
Yeah, one thing I was going to add, when he was talking about sort of like confirmation bias, Malty and I had a really great hangout where we were talking about some stuff about some psychology, and we were talking about strength versus weight in things, and how we as human beings seem naturally driven towards accepting things on their strength rather than their actual weight, and sort of like the example he gave us to the difference between them was like if you think of a letter of recommendation. If you had two letters of recommendation, one said like basically just a list of all of this person's competency and how many hours, the hours that they showed up, how much time they took off, percentage wise, and then you had a really heartwarming emotional letter about how much this person's a nice guy. We buy things more on the emotional side, the strength, than the weight. And I do think this might have something to do with the way human beings think, that emotion isn't ever sort of removed from our thinking process, but sometimes we are less emotionally driven in the things that we think about. And that when we get more emotionally driven, that's when we move from weight into the strength.
That's where I have odds with in fight, because I remove emotions from almost everything, and I have an issue with becoming cold and like a Spock type character, and I don't know that I should put emotions back into it. That's where I'm
Well,
at.
you
I'm
shouldn't
questioning.
be over emotional. You will still have emotions playing. It's still part of the process of how we respond to our stimuli, but it's not your thought process isn't being majorly driven by the emotion, um, but by more the stuff that you're witnessing, not how it makes you feel.
That's what I'm asking. Should I put value on this emotion and put it into and work it in? That's
Well,
too
that
far
actually
right
kind
the value. So.
that actually kind of leads into my next question. There is that we see evidence in things like GMOs and vaccines and evolution, where emotions play a very strong role in denying these things, to reject them straight out. Um, can emotions act in a way that completely inhibit our way to rationalize? And should we be trying to separate our emotions from decisions we make? Is that even possible for us to do?
Um, well, I don't know if it's something we can necessarily do on a conscious level too much. A lot of the stuff that happens before we consciously are aware of information that we're getting is done through subconscious parts of our brain. And so it's very, very hard, but
Well,
I think there are lots of different factors that go into determining how emotionally driven we will be. And there are sorts of varying different things in the environment that can affect how our hormone production is done, which will ultimately change how emotionally reactant we are to stimuli in our environment. And obviously, our exposure to that stimuli in the past. And how we've rationalized things in our environment. Like people who might be getting older and they're getting a bit ill will start to blame that illness on the way food is produced these days. All of these GMOs are what's making me feel sick, not the fact that I'm getting older and my body is declining. And so therefore they'll try and do these big shifts in life and go, I'm going to be, I'm anti-GMOs and I need organic to be healthy. Um, and the emotion, the insecurity around their waning state of health is what drives that, motivates that behavioural change.
I certainly think it's a big part of it, but I think even when we say we're removing emotion from whatever decision, I think it's kind of an indirect way. So, for example, if you're choosing between two homes or two cars, something that's not necessarily emotionally driven, you might be more, attracted to a house or attracted to a car or whatever. But ultimately, it's not the emotion. Perhaps it's the gratification, if you want to call it that, if it's not emotion. So, for example, you may prefer the way the house makes you feel. It may not be an emotion in the sense of, I feel so joyous when I'm around it, but it's this indirect, you want to feel like a good person, and a good person who makes the right decision. So it's not perhaps an emotion in the sort of emotional sense of the word, but perhaps that we want to seem as maybe satisfied or, satiated, or what you want to call it, but
Content content is maybe something. I don't know how much of an emotional attachment that is, but it drives a lot.
But like I said, it's very hard to separate them because they are intertwined. For example, the ABC model of attitude is, as I mentioned in the past, which is affective component. So what feelings and emotions do you have towards it? A behavioural component, and then the cognitive component. So the reason why we hold any belief about anything ever is because of an amalgamation of those three. So it makes us, for example, people might believe in God because it makes them feel good. It answers questions about the world that they don't think are being answered by other things, and it gives them a sense of community or whatever it might be. So this interplay between the three, and it's very difficult to separate them out. So for example, if someone's scared of spiders, that's an affective component, but also it drives their behavior. So for example, I avoid spiders, or I kill them when I see them, or whatever, or I get someone else to get rid of it. And also cognitive components. So why am I scared of spiders? Because I'm scared it's going to bite me and it's going to be poisonous. So you can't really disentangle them other than downplay two or one of them to the point of it's indistinguishable from something that doesn't exist. But I still think there is an underlying each one of those three.
Well, one of the things you brought up there was the so kind of seeking knowledge or truth in things that can't be explained. That's one of the reasons why people would hold certain beliefs. Are we creatures of agency that always have to be looking for that cause? Is that something that's that we hold as a value that might not be always the best thing to be looking for? Is the fact that we're creatures of agency looking for functionality and everything a downside to the way that we think?
It's a little from column A, a little from column B, in that we do look for agency. Even children do. For example, if you ask a child, why do mountains exist or why do trees exist? So why do mountains exist? To make it look good at night time, or why do trees exist? So bears can scratch themselves on them. So they have this sort of teleological tendency towards that things were made for a purpose. So and they know that people don't make trees, people don't make mountains. So they can intuitively come up with the idea of this sort of creator, and people obviously say, "Oh, see, look, it's proof that the knowledge of God is intrinsic." For example, I would say it's perfect evidence of the people writing the Bible didn't understand science and thought that things were made for nature. So it's not really a coincidence that the people writing the Bible said in Romans 1, whatever it is, its invisible attributes comes from nature, paraphrasing slightly. So we do have this agency detection device, and for example, this also links to things like reputation. So for example, we as humans, we value reputation more than most other creatures. We, social hierarchies and so on. We are still very primitive in that respect. I don't mean primitive in a bad way. I just mean it's something from our sort of primitive, primordial history, I guess. But one of them is being watched, and we do behave differently when we're being watched. So, and part of these things is like agency. So for example, the supernatural supernatural punishment hypothesis, I should say, is that, and recently a report came out that for complex societies, just tell them that something's watching them, and they will behave differently, i.e. more moral, if you want to call it that. And this is probably due to partly being watched and partly this agency detection thing, because it's better to think you're being watched and do something well than be watched and do something wrong. So it all kind of links together when it comes to, like I say, when it comes to things like agency and basically seeing more than what there is, things like pareidolia, of seeing faces and things and so on. You know, we have this sort of hyper tendency towards these kind of cognitions, and I think I think evolutionary psychology is one of my passions because it does explain a lot from a very simple framework of our brains have evolved, not as fast as our phenotypes, our bodies essentially, that we haven't quite adjusted to civilization. We are quite primitive in that sense, but because of that, we can explain a lot of human behavior. But yeah, agency detection and agency acting upon agency is also a very big determinant, particularly within like I say with creationism and things like that. It is a very big part of it.
When you talk about evolutionary psychology and the fact that our brains are still evolving now, in the environment that we are now, do you think that we'll see a movement towards more statistical or probabilistic thinking?
I mean, it's funny because I part of my master's course is a lot of statistics, and some of statistics is absurd. It's like ridiculously. I don't really understand why you're doing that. But at the same time, the reason why we do statistics is because, for example, science works on probabilistic thinking. But it's more obvious when it comes to like quantum mechanics that it is probabilistic. You can't get over that. But at the same time, humans are probabilistic. So for example, at some point I'll probably go through my results, and it'll be the average of 225 responses or so on. Now what I could do is say I'm going to take 4 people, I'm going to interview them for an hour and get why they don't accept science. But trying to extrapolate that to 7 billion people is a lot more difficult than 225, which isn't a massive number, but it's a lot more than 4. So the reason why we do sort of statistics in particular psychology, but also a lot of science, is because you get to know a lot more about the world because you have a bigger sample. So the population is 7 billion. The closer you get to 7 billion, the easier it is to extrapolate from your doing. So I don't know if we will evolve better statistical thinking. I think it's much more a case of the it's almost a spandrel of it's sort of evolved alongside or against our intuition. So I think it's more a case of when we talk about anything evolving, like brain, any phenotypes, what we're actually saying is genes that get selected for that build brains that value whatever it might be. So genes that build brains that value altruism survive, which is the selfish gene model. That it's the unit of selection is the gene. So I think it takes a long time for the gene to change because whatever it's doing it well because it's survived for however many billion years. So I think it's not going to be a quick fix of teach people statistics and they will reason better, because it's genes that build brains, and some people just don't get statistical thinking. Some people just don't understand. For example, part of the problem of accepting evolution is the fact you've got to think of populations rather than an individual trying to evolve. The reason why Lamarck came before Darwin was because it's more intuitive to think this giraffe is stretching to get leaves and therefore he's stretching his neck and then will pass on this trait to his offspring, rather than in a group of giraffes, some of them have longer necks, some of them have shorter necks, and the ones with longer necks are more likely to survive and reproduce. That's a lot more counterintuitive than immediate, mechanistic processes rather than statistical thinking. So there is no real sort of quick fix when it comes to evolving the statistical thinking gene, essentially.
I do think there's also other things like how certain things like viruses and bacteriums affect the way our brains work as well. Like, is it toxoplasmosis, which is found in cat feces? I believe that can affect the way the brain functions if you get infected with it, as well as neurosyphilis as well. These things can change how brains work. So the more or less of those things in the environment can alter the average of a population's thinking.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of the ins and outs of it, but I can certainly see the logic behind it.
So right now, you do a lot of the you've used YouTube and Google Plus in these communities to collect data for uh, your papers that you've done right now on the oh shoot, what is it again?
Just the values thing.
Yeah, the role of personal values and the acceptance of scientific evidence in relation to social scientific issues.
There we go. You got it.
I did write it down. So what kind of data have you gotten from that so far?
Well, it's funny you should ask. I'm actually going to do a world exclusive, apart from slightly before when we were offline. But world exclusive of, I'm going to go through it. This is the preliminary, basically what you get off, the averages for everything. I've not done the actual analysis yet, so I can't say if anything's statistically significant. But this is just the raw, as I see it now, without doing any tests. So this is, if you are screen sharing, the difference between males and females. Not something I'm particularly interested in. I think it's more if I want to get this published, I think more journals are interested in the difference between males and females. But here it is anyway. What I found interesting is, apart from this last one, which is provisional, which if anyone hasn't done the questionnaire, this probably makes no sense. But provisional is based on the question of that knowledge about each of these 4 topics, which is climate change, evolution, vaccines, and GMOs, is provisional and subject to change, essentially. So the difference there is 0.02. They're again almost identical scores. Yet for other ones, it's half a point, which is the points here in case people are wondering. The lower the numbers indicate strongly disagree, and the higher the number indicates strongly agree. So, for example, there wasn't a massive fluctuation. For example, there wasn't women entirely agree on something and men entirely disagree, but these are pretty big changes. So, for example, what's a good one? The government one, probably. Maybe not. I don't know. But basically, women are more skeptical, I guess, or less confident in science than men. If anyone's got any questions about that, I can go through this. Otherwise, I can go into the next one. I don't know how interested people are in sex differences, so I'll leave it up to people to decide.
I'm quite interested in a lot of the stuff about sexual dimorphism in our species, in terms of not just biology but psychology as well.
Oh yeah, I think I did do a video about how parental investment seems to play a massive role in sexual dimorphism, in that just by the fact that women can only have one baby every 9 months, whereas a man could theoretically, father a child every night of the week if he had so much stamina. But so I think for example, and it's not a coincidence that men have however many million sperm and women have 1 egg a month, and so this is a very big driving force of what we think of as sexual dimorphism, because it also links into things like body size. So for example, you can see with humans, it's quite similar. You can't, if you had a male skull and a female skull, or a male skeleton and a female skeleton, they're not that different. You can tell differences, obviously, but it's not like certain species in which there is a definite male and female based on for example, the male being so significantly, more
larger or smaller.
Exactly, yeah. So
there are differences. There was a good post I saw on Facebook about skulls, where somebody was trying to make the point, it was like people kissing, and it was like an X-ray, and like someone was trying to make the point like, oh, you don't know anything about these people other than they're in love, and somebody pointed out, well, actually, due to the shape of the person on the left's like jaw and ridges and the cranial sort of cap and stuff like that, you could tell not only the rough age of the person, but you could tell what that one of them was African American woman, and the other one was a Caucasian male, and both were between the ages of about 25 to 40. So it's amazing of what out there in our bodies, if these tiny little things that you need to know what you're looking for, that can actually tell you quite a bit about differences. But I mean, if you didn't know about all of these tiny minute little differences, they are quite similar.
Oh, that's very interesting. I've not heard of that. I remember seeing a lecture years ago about something very similar that you compare two schools that look pretty similar, and like you say, based on very simple, I guess, cues, you can tell the differences and tell, like you say, more than what meets the eye. And the trained eye is much more acute at picking that sort of thing up. But no,
Well,
it's
there's
very,
things like Caucasian Europeans share obviously a lot of genetics with Neanderthals compared to, and certain different sort of tribes, had certain different gene selection from where we were less mobile, where sort of like one group settled in an area and they all share similar characteristics, and there wasn't as much migration sort of done because people tend to stay in the country that they were in. That you can tell a lot about people just from these certain differences because of breeding patterns. I mean,
So,
things like countries where you get like people are known for certain hair colors or eye colors.
so the page that you're on right now, this is comparing scientific endorsement in 5 different educational levels across 4 social scientific issues. Um, so you said the higher number is the strongly agree,
yes.
right? Okay. So um, with the let's see here. So across the different levels that we have here in scientific basis, I'm trying to understand what were the questions? Sorry for that you were asking for this again.
Okay, so I'll go individually. So objectivity is basically for each of these 4 issues. So scientists within X, so climate change, evolutions, vaccines, so on, try and be as objective as possible. So most people strongly agree, or between agree and strongly agree. Basically, the numbers in brackets, I should say, is standard deviation, which basically means how spread is the data. So it's basically, think of it as plus or minus. So 4.2 plus or minus 1, which obviously makes no sense because it goes above 5 and that was the limit. But basically think of it as most people hovered around the 3 to 5 number. And the same thing was with all the other ones. So think of it as plus or minus. So basically, a lot of people thought 4. What's interesting about the first one in particular, well, maybe not the first one, what's a good one? I just saw it before. La, 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 la. But basically, it's not what you'd expect. And what I found very counterintuitive is that people with for example, the second one, which is scientific basis. So scientific basis is the only way of measuring climate change, for example. So it's basically saying we shouldn't really take into account feelings and emotions and religious belief and so on. We should base our model about climate change on the science rather than anything else. And as you can see, the highest level was no higher education, and then obviously followed by a PhD, which for most of these, that's a kind of common pattern. Um, that you see this sort of U shape almost, that high or very high on no higher education and PhD, and then currently completing a bachelor's degree is kind of usually the lowest one or the most skeptical one. It could be, when I say lowest, it could also be strongly disagree and so on. But I think this is very interesting that it's sort of people have this conception of science. So people who haven't done higher education think, well, because I haven't done science, I'm just going to trust what scientists say. Whereas people who perhaps have done or are doing their bachelor's think, well, I'm seeing all these tricks and these little tactics that people do within science that it's not quite as rigid and reliable as people think. And then when people have done their bachelor's and master's and PhD, then it starts to pick up again and say, okay, now we've realized, okay, maybe it is a bit more complicated, but also it is very stringent. For example, when you work out, when you realize how stringent peer review is, for example, I think that's very interesting. That's what I would guess is going on here. That people
Can
have
I
this
ask you a
view about.
question, Dave?
By all means,
Have
yeah.
you thought of taking these numbers? Because obviously with science, we try and limit the variables to find causality or to find something's relative level of causality. So we take two groups of mice, we give them all the same things except one variable changes between the groups. Say one's given cannabis and the other one isn't, and then we extrapolate mortality rates and stuff like that. Have you thought of trying to factor out age in this because of obviously people of certain ages will fall mainly into those categories more than others. So people who are going to be doing sort of like currently completing bachelor's degrees are going to be quite young adults a lot of the time, or you know, that sort of age,
Yeah,
and no higher education that and
And
that
region. Did you take in
takes
region?
anybody in there. So I think one thing might be good is to take this data, and if you do know the ages of the people who answered, try and see if you can factor out the age in there somehow, um, to see how that affects the data at all.
Yeah, and did you
Because
take
people who have
region
PhDs
into account on
and
it? Did you take
sorry.
region? I know you went across the whole world on collecting your data, but
Yeah,
was region involved in any of it?
it was education. Sorry, country of education. So I wasn't particularly interested where people were from. It was more where they were educated. So I did do age as well. I didn't do specific ages. It was sort of 18 to 29, 30 to 39, 40 to 49, 50 to 59, and over 60, I think it was.
Right.
So I guess the thing is, I will be doing a video about this at some point. But essentially, there's three types of research. Two main ones are exploratory research and confirmatory research. This is probably what I'd call the former. So this is exploratory research. So basically, I'm testing a lot of things to see what the hell is going on here because this is such a new topic that no one's actually done kind of anything like this.
Right, right.
Um, that I'm basically finding, does OSI predict acceptance of science? Does personal values accept science? Does education level accept relate to science? So basically, what I will do eventually is do what's called a regression, and it's a statistical test in which I go, which factor is actually playing the biggest part here, and basically everything else is sort of limited to everything else is sort of put on background essentially, and say which one is actually doing the biggest job, which one's doing its greater than fair share. So is it people who don't accept science have the lowest science education, for example, like what it's on now, or is it the lowest OSI score, which I think the next table will go into that? Is it people, and then basically you add all the factors and say which one is the driving force behind it. So basically I put all the factors in and say this explains 90% of the data. Then if I get rid of OSI, if it drops to like 40%, you say, okay, this plays a big part in it. So you've got to have, so basically build a model then. So when you say, in order to accept science, you need to have a high OSI score, you need to have higher education, you need to have higher openness and high self transcendence. And basically that'll be my model, and then you keep taking stuff away until the variance, which is basically the how much data it explains essentially. So I certainly think there are things I can get rid of in here that you kind of, like I say, compare like for like. So someone with a PhD who has high openness compared to someone with a PhD with high conservation, for example, which one accepts science, or both accept science?
So
So
for anybody that's watching, by the way, I'm just going to just jump in here for a quick second, is that we will be doing the usual format where probably in the next 10-15 minutes or so, we're going to make the link public, open it up if anybody has any questions that they want to come in and ask Dave regarding to what he's studying here, or any other questions that you think are relevant to the topic at hand. Feel free to come in, or if you don't want to do that, leave any questions in the comments section, and we will read them out here as well.
yeah, I'm happy to do that. So get your questions coming.
Awesome. Yeah, it's very interesting. The study looks, I mean, even on this scale, how detailed it is great.
I'm definitely looking forward to the video on it. They'll probably
Yeah.
explain it a lot, explain it pretty clearly.
Rather than the pages and pages of numbers and brackets. So
I do like figures and diagrams, but I can't always understand them.
Right,
yeah,
right.
because I've been doing this for probably about, it seems like forever now. These are just, it's like I actually had a dream about Excel last night. That's how much I've been doing stats. It's like the Matrix now with all the numbers scrolling through. It's
All
like,
right. Oh, yeah, I don't see it anymore. I just see blonde, brunette.
The there is one interesting thing on this page, I think it is here, and that is the comparing scientific endorsement between religious affiliation / beliefs across for the social scientific issues, and you see like in the objectivity there, for example, is the no religious affiliation have a much higher belief in, I guess, the objectivity of the scientists compared to the theists. There, it's noticeably lower. And it's like that in a lot of the categories, except the government one I find fascinating. Is that
Yeah, it's one of the few ones that there is a noticeable, like two of them are nearly three, and three is neither agree nor disagree, which is basically I mean, I threw it in there because I thought some people just genuinely have no idea. But to go from 1.3 in evolution to 2.55, that's a pretty noticeable like difference. In the same way, 1.73 to 3, that's a massive jump. And I did do a video months ago about why people don't accept evolution, and I said it's not due to religion. There are other factors which,
Right.
in a way, it's true in that evolution is noticeably lower. But also look at, for example, GMOs for objectivity. It goes from 3.53 to 4.54, which is mental, really. That I didn't think religion was going to be a predictor. I was sort of doing that more out of curiosity. I think my supervisor actually mentioned it. I wasn't really particularly interested in it, and I thought it's not going to be religion, so there's no point. And he said, no, it'll be interesting. So, but yeah, it's very, very revealing, I guess. So I think it is kind of wholesale skepticism of these socio-scientific issues within this sample. I've got to say, like you say, you pointed out, there's 183 nons, I've called them, because people put skeptic, agnostic, and so on. And there was one Wiccan, which I didn't know. I knew a Wiccan person, but yeah, comparing that to 40, it would be nice if there was even numbers. But what I can do is various statistical jiggery-pokery to make sure that they're basically representative of, basically equal. But if this is anything to go by, religion is more of a driving force than I perhaps thought. And obviously, I think most people probably had that suspicion anyway, and I was sort of skeptical of, well, it's certain types of religious people which are also sort of conspiracy theorist minded, and for example, I'm trying to think of a conspiracy theorist who isn't religious, but I'm struggling, to be honest. But that sort of, skeptical of the government, but not just. But I just found this very interesting that there is such a difference in, I think, everything. To be honest, I can't, apart from the last one, which was again the provisional one. I'll go back onto it. I think it's the next page. Again, almost no difference. So when it comes to provisional, again, sorry, I should probably clarify, is what scientists know about each of these issues is provisional.
Can I ask Dave a quick question about this belief formation process?
Yeah, by all means.
It's just that I was Sokka. They did a Deeper Than Dogma show a couple weeks ago about deism, and something I've wondered about myself is, why I don't find the deistic notion more compelling than I do. I feel like I've looked at their reasons, and I don't find it. It just doesn't compel me the way it compels them. And so I wonder why that is, and because I feel like I'm evaluating a certain set of data and I'm reaching a certain conclusion, and other people are evaluating a similar set of data and not reaching the same conclusion as me. And so, I wonder if there's any way to know what it is that determines whether one person will reach a certain conclusion or a different conclusion, or whether it's just that any individual's specific set, the sort of network of beliefs in their head is so unique to the individual that maybe you could never really tell.
No, I agree with what you're saying, and that's the problem. The problem that arises with me on that exact same question. Excuse me, is that in mine there's reasons I don't have emotions when I put it into evaluating that set of data, and that's why I'm wondering how valuable emotions are in evaluating these sets of data.
I think. Sorry, carry on.
Yeah, I wonder how much of it's based on need to believe.
That was going to be my first response as well. That, for example, I've been talking to, I think it was on a comment to Once Forgiven Now Free's video. So I think he sounded like a young Earth creationist, but he was saying, well, creationists can come up with a model to explain the diversity of life as well? And the answer is you can. In the same way, I can come up with a model to explain it now, that it was all done by a pixie, and
Right.
it just made it look like things evolved. You can come up with a model to explain. It's a just so story.
A sufficient.
It's a pseudo explanation.
Exactly. It's in the same
A
way.
post-hoc rationalization.
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's
Yeah.
sufficient. It's sufficient to explain it. It's just not necessary to explain.
Sufficient, but not at all plausible.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, sufficient is one thing, but then you have to actually have a reason other than
Right.
its
Yeah, that's what I'm
sufficiency.
saying. It's sufficient.
I think-
It's just not necessary.
I think
Well-
emotion plays its part in that, because if we're created by a super perfect being in some way, that makes us feel good about us. It helps us hide from a lot of the insecurities that we maybe are aware of on some sort of conscious or subconscious level.
Yeah, I get all that. But I have all those needs still. I have all of those needs still, but I'm not clinging to the God belief, and I'm not clinging to the hope of an afterlife. I've given up on that, you know. So I'm wondering, like, what makes one person. This is really an important question, I think, because I think of it like a certain environment, a certain social or cultural environment will produce certain results. That situations produce outcomes. And so if you have the certain situation, you're likely to produce people. Cults, think about a cult. People who are otherwise normal get put into this certain situation, in this case like a toxic situation, where they start believing wacky things and they end up in a suicide cult, and they're dead. And that's a worst case scenario, of course. But other better case scenarios are really good schools and really intelligent, informed people producing different results, more desirable results. So, like, what types of environments, what types of situations can we produce that will lead people to the types of outcomes that we are hoping to achieve, right?
I don't think I don't think you're going to get. I think you're going to struggle with it, because I think what it comes down to, or at least it seems to be for me, is this conceptualization of an idea. So I would actually argue that the pixie idea is much more, it's much simpler to conceptualize than the nebulous entity that the God character is, right? Because you can assign attributes in reality to it. So for me, it's always been an issue of conceptualizing it. I've never been able to reach that step of understanding, because the terms are so they become so meaningless to me.
The term I learned recently was delta. That a delta, you can put a delta in the equation that can morph itself into whatever you need it to make the answer.
Yeah,
Well, delta is just a symbol, just means change in most.
Right. That's what I'm saying. You can put it in any equation. It can change to get you the outcome that you want, or to fit the equation.
It's like
Right.
saying widget when you're trying to explain something, but carry on.
Yeah, so if you have this person who is capable of inserting this delta, if you want to call it that, into any given situation, it's a question of how do you get someone to recognize that the insertion that they've put in is either useless or circular in some fashion, or incoherent. And I think with like the gods concept, at least, there is. Well, obviously there's some sort of agreed conceptualization where it has a series of attributes that are unrecognizable in some fashion, to us, I would say, at least. And I think that's where you're always going to get the difference, because I think some people are going to be able to take particular attributes of the reality and infer something much more. I don't know how. Some immaterial thing to go along with it, whereas I don't think, if you're looking at it from a skeptical point of view, you are going to be able to rationalize it to that extent, because a lot of us fall down, I think, with the idea of creating something outside of our reality and then assigning attributes based within reality to it.
I have a problem with the need to add that to anything. I don't know where I'd get a reason to add these things and how they actually do apply to reality. That's my stop.
This is maybe going back a little ways, but I have a problem with completely vilifying emotion because I think that our emotions are so tied in with our dreams, our goals, our values, that to just, I mean, there's, you know, the logical fallacy of arguing from emotion or appealing to emotion, but that doesn't mean that emotion is just bad across the board. You know,
I wouldn't try to
I
build
think
that.
there's a mistake there that we can make when we can say, oh, we need to be unbiased, and to be unbiased is to be unemotional and robotic. And but I think that emotion has a part to play in you know, our curiosity and our drive to.
That's an issue I have, Vinny. That's an issue I have, is that I have emotions. They just don't apply to my decisions.
Well, that's not true either. I mean,
it is in my case. That's the thing I'm saying. It is in my case. I don't want to put it on air. Why? It is part of the case with me.
Oh, okay.
That's why it's such a big question to me. I'm trying to understand why it is tied in, and is it need to be tied in?
Xbox is actually Vulcan, and he's trying to learn the mystery.
Oh, no. I said I feel emotions.
I see, but they don't affect your decisions.
Right.
Should we consider emotion irrational or irrational?
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, we all have emotions. You know, how you act, how you respond to it. You know, what conclusions come from it afterwards, I think would be deemed rational or irrational. But having the emotion itself is neither. It's irrational.
Yeah, I mean, emotion will be part of the process, whether you want it to or not. Especially when you're dealing with things that cut to the core of who you are, or you know, where we came from. God, the afterlife, spirituality, things like this. It's hard not to feel anything when thinking about those things, especially when you're really struggling over it.
But is there?
Yeah, go ahead.
Is there a difference between? I mean, I wasn't suggesting that you have to, you know, get rid of emotion. In order for us to be completely rational, we can't have emotion. I mean, it's what makes us who we are. But there has. Do you think it would be beneficial for people to realize, you know, do kind of like a self-evaluation, I guess you could say, in a way, of decisions that they make, and learn how to separate their emotion out of it? You know, why do I feel this way? Well, let me think about this for a second. You know, is it affecting my conclusion?
Yeah, I mean, if you could come up with some kind of a procedure for detecting something like motivated reasoning, for knowing when you're reasoning to a conclusion because you refuse to consider the alternative because it's too difficult to change your mind about something. So I mean, there seem like there should be procedures for detecting your own biases, and science does the best they can with things like double-blind studies and peer review to detect you know, people who are being dishonest intentionally or unintentionally. But you know, for ourselves, I think there are methods, there are ways.
The problem is when it comes to sort of everyday decision making, as opposed to sort of scientific decision making, is a lot of the biases we engage in are actually unconscious. So the reason, for example, when you see, particularly in Hangouts, because it's sort of immediate. I mean, when it comes to like video responses, you can take your time to think about. I mean, obviously it depends. Like when I see like True Empiricism, he just seems to fire up his camera and talk. But most of the time when we do video responses to people, we have this calculated, you know, response, and we script it out and we think about it. But with Hangouts, you see almost their true colours, and you see this, you can see the cogs turning almost. And I think a lot of it is this unconscious, you know. For example, the hot issue of the last few weeks, I don't know if it's still going on, is the slavery in the Bible thing. And you see people like G-Man, I think, physically squirming when they have to rationalise that they know slavery. He must know slavery is wrong. If he doesn't, and I don't want to be too blunt here, but he is black, and if he doesn't understand this, he has to rationalize this, and he has this most elaborate, you know, web of, you know, well, NBA players are, you know, slaves to their, you know, employers, and everyone's a slave to employer, or everyone's slave to their sin, or everyone's slave to whatever, and you can see him squirming because he must know what he's saying is this rationalization. I mean, I refuse to accept that he doesn't know this, that he's sort of dug this far down, so he's just thought, I can't turn back now, you know. So I think you do see people, you know, but it's an unconscious thing that we don't consciously think, I'm going to convince myself that this is the case. Because how convincing would that sound? For example, if you go for a job interview and don't get it, it's not very convincing to hear yourself go, well, he was just a knob and they were just out to get me and so on. It's a lot more convincing to actually sort of, it's like lying. You're a lot more convincing if you convince yourself when it comes to anything. And I think that's the thing that because it's unconscious, you don't actually know, well, I'm going to convince myself of this, or I'm going to rationalize this position. It just kind of, I have this view and I want to defend it, and I come up with these any wild excuses. And I think we're all kind of prone to this, and like you say, the case of motivated reasoning. I think everyone has motivated reasoning. Sometimes the motivations are good. There's things like there's the difference between accuracy goals and partisan goals, which is basically accuracy goals is kind of as it sounds, that you want to be accurate, you want to make the normative decision, whereas partisan goals is I want to reason to a conclusion. So we all have motivated reasonings. Just sometimes it's like the same way we're all biased. Sometimes we're biased in a good way, in that we're trying to be positively biased, or it's like discriminating. You can positively discriminate as well as being positively biased. But I think like motivated reasoning is the key, I think, phrase to talk about when it comes to any sort of psychology beliefs, if you want to call it that.
Is it the difference between taking a look at the evidence and following it to where it leads, or coming at it where you have the conclusion? How do I rationalize the data to make sure that that conclusion is always what I'm going to get?
Exactly, yeah. It's what I call top-down versus bottom-up processing. It's like William Lane Craig does perfect top-down. God exists, how can I reason to him? I think Alvin Flanagan does a much better job of it, but I think he's a bit more transparent because he's doing a better job at it, but, counterintuitive. Whereas, Billy Lane Craig is what sounds the most intuitive to people, things having a cause, and then reason the conclusion that God exists. Whereas bottom-up is where I think Scott Clifton, Theoretical Bullshit, did his metaphysical cherry-picking video explaining where, if you take that to its logical conclusion, this is actually what happens, and this is the actual conclusion. But this sort of cherry-picking of metaphysics, essentially. But this sort of reasoning to a conclusion, it's like, the scientific method is following the evidence where it leads, whereas creationist method is getting your conclusion and finding what evidence you can to support it. And that is, and the same way, going back to the moral dumbfounding thing, a lot of people do. I don't want to say everyone does that, but when it comes to emotional reasoning, sometimes we have this intrinsic, this sounds disgusting, I've got to find a way to rationalize why I don't want to perform action X, or why action X is somehow immoral. And then you think, I can't actually think of a good reason behind it, but I still can't relinquish it. I still can't, force myself to accept.
One of the questions I wanted to ask you, Dave, is would you say that, or what would you say if someone were to start off with an irrational belief and then have subsequent beliefs after that? Can any of those beliefs be justifiably rationalized, or will it always then boil down to an irrationality? Do you think you can have beliefs that are rational outside of like the follow-on from an irrational belief?
I think you can. I think it's kind of like if you mishear a question and you get the right answer, you just get. For example, I said, "What's 14 times?" and you think I said 14 times 7, but I actually said 14 times 14 times 11. You might get the right answer. You just got the wrong input. And in the same way, I think you can get the quote-unquote right answer from the wrong starting point, essentially. So I don't think it's like, in maths exams you get credit for showing you're working. So if you accidentally do all the working for it's a wrong question, or you get the right formula or whatever, but the actual answer was wrong. It's kind of the flip side of that you can start with the wrong assumption, a wrong belief. That's
wrong premise.
Exactly. But you, for example, like you say with premises, you can have an invalid, but I don't want to say sound because it's not sound, but with a correct conclusion. So, for example, what's a good example? All frogs are fish. No, sorry. All birds are fish. I can't remember what it's called now.
Oh, the swan. You can do the swan problem with the all swans are black, or all swans are white.
No, it's that is part of something else, but essentially it's something like.
Are you talking about the whole all A's are B's and all B's are C's, or all A's C's thing? Is that
it's kind of that, but it's sort of all A's are C's, all D's are F's, therefore all A's are B's. It basically you can do it incorrect, but with the right conclusion, the correct conclusion. I'm trying to think of an example here. I'll give an opposite example. All fish are mammals. A dolphin is a fish, therefore a dolphin is a mammal. That makes no sense. That is invalid in that it doesn't. You can have incorrect premises but come to the conclusion that it's right. Sorry, that took far too long to explain. But essentially, you can have two incorrect premises but still have the correct conclusion. And I think you can have an incorrect or irrational belief. I don't think there is such thing as you know, I guess it's the starting point as well as the ending point that makes it's like the start of the journey, end of a journey. How you get there is kind of irrelevant sometimes, but the
Yeah, that makes sense.
you
That makes
know
sense because we argued the other day that a lot of things come from irrational beliefs. You start with an irrational belief and can actually reach a valid conclusion.
yeah, that summed up what I was trying to explain for about 5 minutes.
Oh,
So thank you.
sorry. Yeah. We had a long discussion about that the other day with someone on arguing that things in the past have started, even science and things have started with irrational things and worked their way to.
Oh, I mean, a good example from psychology is phrenology. So if anyone's seen the picture of a head with loads of writing on it, that's a phrenology map. What's it called? I don't know what it's called. But basically, they thought that the different bumps and ridges
The
and so
bumps on your head, yeah.
was the a determinant of your personality. They weren't a million miles away in that, for example, if you have a part of the brain that puts extra pressure on a part of your, sorry, if you put a bit of your skull puts extra pressure on part of your brain, you will have a change in personality. It's not because of the bump per se, it's because it's the pressure on the brain. So it's not these bumps that are magical or whatever it was. It's a case of it influences your brain, essentially. So again, it's this irrational notion of, bumps and, so on your cranium dictate your personality. They were in the right ballpark, but they missed the kind of key bit of the brain issue. So
Can I
Well,
see
it's
something?
just like with a
Sorry,
lot
sorry,
of
go
human
ahead.
knowledge, we notice things in our environment, but because we lack other data that helps validate and verify our conclusions, we can draw any conclusion from the limited evidence that we have. Um, it's like a lot of the stuff that Freud said. He was noticing certain sort of phenomena that was going on, but his explanations of what's actually going on aren't quite, as solid as they should be.
that was such a PC way of saying it.
Hey, Dave. Hey,
I'm
Dave.
going to. Sorry, I'm going to.
Go ahead.
Benny. Last question. Then after that, we're going to move on to just any closing remarks that anybody might have, and then we're going to shut it down there because I know it's getting late for some of our participants from across the pond there. So sorry. Go ahead, Benny.
Yeah, I was just going to say that Dave said something about the gay marriage discussion toward the beginning of this talk, and I think that's a really good example of something that's not really a ration. In most cases, it's not a rationally formed belief. It's more like emotional revulsion. People who, if you ask them their reasoning, well, why should gay marriage be illegal? And they'll say something like what Dave said, that they're more promiscuous and therefore this and this. And you can show them, well, okay, the gay men might be more promiscuous, but the women are actually less promiscuous. So I mean, should it be just against the rules for men? And when it comes down to it, they're against it because they find it icky. I mean, really, that's what it is. But we don't legislate based on what we find icky. We don't legislate purely based on emotional attitudes of revulsion. So you all might be into stuff that I find icky, but that's not a rational reason for making it illegal. So, but if you try to explain this to someone who wants to outlaw gay marriage for whatever emotional reason or what they might think is an intellectual reason, they won't see it that way. And so I'm wondering if you, Dave, or any other, I guess anyone else who studied it, knows any way to help someone recognize when they're making this type of mistake, or how to recognize this type of mistake in yourself.
Yeah, it's real good.
When you're using sort of an invalid process, an invalid or unreliable reasoning method to reach your conclusions, how to improve that.
Yeah, that's real good because otherwise,
I think it changes person to person. With some people, if you mock them for their stupidity, it gives them a negative consequence to what they've done, and then from that it sows the little seed of doubt, and they, it makes them think about it a lot more, and the more they think about it, the higher the chances that they'll come to, a much better resolution of their understanding. But with some people, obviously, if you go in too hard, all you're going to do is reaffirm that belief. It almost becomes, I'm going to keep believing that gays are bad just to piss you off.
Yeah, they'll recoil and turn into an offensive position.
Although it's kind of like
If you look at our laws, that's how they've evolved. Is from there are a lot of laws that in the past that were based on feeling icky, and we've realized and weeded as many out so far as we can.
Well, yeah, like putting towards like the whole idea. I think people who think it's like just icky, I think you can have a much easier time like convincing them that they're either misguided in their beliefs or there's something inaccurate there. I think it comes back down to the idea of values. So there will be people who value a rational way of thinking or a particular fairness, and I think like with those people it'll be quite easy to convince. But when you deal with, and I'm picking a bit, but like fundamentalist religious folk, their values lie elsewhere. So they value the praise or the appeasing this character they worship, right? So that is their value. That is their high. That's the higher of their values. So
They feel good about it.
yeah, exactly. You have to try and find a way to at least help them recognize that maybe this value is not as great as it is, or it's a very difficult one, because how do you try to explain to someone that this idea that they have of a character, of a concept, is that they believe it's so wonderful and everything like, and is causing harm,
Right.
and getting them to recognize, I think, that their values are perhaps in the wrong place.
Yeah, it's a tough one. It's a good question, Benny. That's a tough one.
So on that note, we're going to just kind of go through here. If anybody has any last comments that they want to put out there, feel free to do it now before we go off air. But Xbox?
Yeah, no, I've enjoyed this a lot. Thank you so much, Dave. It's been a great time.
Okay, Floyd?
Yeah, it's good stuff. Thanks for having me.
Chaz?
be excellent to each other and do drugs.
Party on.
The views expressed by Chaz do not represent that of the Deeper Than Dogma. Benny?
Yeah, I've enjoyed listening, and it's been a good show. So thanks for the invitation, and that's it. Look forward to seeing you guys next week.
All right, Alex?
Thanks, guys, for bringing me on, and thanks for inviting me, and it's been great. I've enjoyed it.
All right, cool. Dave, feel free to, anything that you want to add here at the end, plug your channel, do whatever you want. It's floor is yours.
Well, I was going to say, about 10 minutes before we went live, I actually uploaded a video giving you a shout out. So I think partly because from when I've been involved before and also watching, I've really enjoyed it, and tonight's been no exception. Hopefully I've given at least food for thought, if nothing else. And other than that, yeah, thanks for a really interesting discussion, and hopefully we'll do it again sometime.
Well, that'd be great. Yeah, and again, yeah, Dave, thank you very much for coming on, and of course the rest of the panel that came on tonight. Thank you very much, and thanks for everybody that watched. And hopefully check us out our previous episodes as well as next week. So on that note, talk to you guys later. Have a good one.